Shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I can't wait to tell you about the deal they're offering, so stay tuned. With the AYANEO 2 campaign now launching, I thought it'd be a good time to talk about my time with AYANEO's previous handheld, the AYANEO Air Pro. I think that the Air Pro is in a weight class of PC handhelds that has very little competition. Only the GPD Win 3 and the upcoming GPD Win 4 are in the ballpark at all. But despite the weight class, despite the absolutely premium feel, despite the better overall compatibility than the Steam Deck, and despite the absolutely gorgeous display, it still has some hurdles that prevents it from being my personal daily driver, and I'm going to tell you all about it because some of these hurdles are incredibly personal, and I'm curious to know what you think by the end of my review. So let's get into it. What's good, Deck Gang? Plenty of people have reviewed the Air Pro by now, and many of them are in fact onto the AYANEO 2, but in my mind the Air Pro remains special because of its power to size ratio. It's much smaller than the Steam Deck and still considerably smaller than an AYANEO 2, but it's strong, like bull. Of course, the power isn't enough to dethrone the current champions, but again, it's the power to size that's impressive. We'll get to benchmarks and specs later, but the chip that's powering this device is a Ryzen 5825U, and the TLDW is that it's quite capable. I can reasonably play Spider-Man Remaster on this. The caveat, I suppose, is that even though the Pro model has an upgraded battery, the 38 watt-hours on here is barely enough to get an hour of playtime out of a game like that. Of course, you can tinker with the settings and TDP to stretch it further, but that's the baseline you're working with. On the other hand, it's the fact that you can play Spider-Man Remastered on a device that you can genuinely put in your pants pocket that's pretty phenomenal. By the way, these are not recessed analog sticks, so you probably don't want to actually put this in your pocket. I'm just saying it fits. Just as impressive as the power on the Air Pro is the effort that AYANEO has made toward making PC gaming as streamlined as possible. Now, don't get me wrong. It's nowhere near what Valve has done with the Steam Deck, but it's leaps and bounds beyond what other PC handheld manufacturers have done. AYANEO has a central software called AYASpace, which has a robust set of features which can at times be buggy. To start, there's a control panel that has some features similar to the quick access menu on the Steam Deck. You can get to it with a press of the AYA button on the bottom right. From here, you can quickly slide volume and brightness. You can set the resolution, TDP, and the fan curve. You can see some hardware metrics at a glance, and you can even add custom buttons here for quick access to things like the virtual keyboard, FSR, and screenshotting. You can hold the same button to pull up the full version of AYASpace. You get more hardware metrics from here. You can also calibrate and customize the controls, and these options are surprisingly robust. And finally, you have a game library aggregator. This tries to pull all the games from various launchers and uses the metadata to find images and media for these games. This functionality can be pretty hit and miss, and your mileage is going to vary with any library aggregator, but AYASpace trails pretty far behind what Playnight and Launchbox have in terms of functionality. But to be honest, it is the effort that I'm impressed with. AYANEO has been developing AYASpace for a couple of years now, and despite the shortcomings, they're clearly committed to making PC gaming as accessible as possible. SteamOS is perfecting PC gaming on Linux, and AYASpace is the closest thing we have on Windows, so I not only find it commendable, but it did in fact enhance my experience over other Windows handhelds. Similarly, the hardware buttons that are provided to navigate Windows are helpful too. I already mentioned the AYA button in the bottom right, but to the right of that is a Show Desktop button. There are also these buttons to the inside of the bumpers that are referred to as LC and RC. You can configure these for up to 4 additional Windows-based actions. So for example, I currently have it set so that pressing LC brings up the on-screen keyboard, while holding LC brings up the task manager. Once again, the options that work are awesome, but some options like binding a button to opening Steam doesn't always work for me. In any case, the controls also automatically toggle between mouse controls and game controls somewhat seamlessly. Other handheld PCs like the GPD Win series of devices have a dedicated button to toggle these, but the software on the Air Pro attempts to determine if you're in a game or not, and if you're not, it's going to automatically set the left analog as a mouse pointer and the A button becomes left click. The problem with this sort of automatic toggling is that if it fails even one time, it can be very jarring and very annoying. Generally speaking, the controls and system itself has a really premium feel. In comparison, the Steam Deck feels utilitarian. Form follows function on the deck. But on the Air Pro, they went the extra mile to make the look and feel of everything top notch. The analog sticks are Hall sensor based, the D-pad and buttons are clicky and feel better to my touch than the Steam Deck. Even the touchscreen feels much more accurate than the Steam Deck. Finally, all of the accents, including the LEDs on the sticks, are a touch above what's offered elsewhere. That reminds me, today's sponsor Squarespace is also a touch above what's offered elsewhere. Look, I've done it all. I've built sites from scratch, I've used content management systems, I've used static site generators, but nothing compared to my experience of using Squarespace. Squarespace has excellent features for creating a blog, starting an online store, and finding the right audience using their SEO tools. They have pre-built layouts that are professional looking and customizable, so you can still make your site look unique. So head over to squarespace.com/fantodeck to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using my code FANTODECK. So let's get back to the performance of the Air Pro. By default, iSpace provides you with 4 options for setting the TDP, 5 watts for saving power, 8 watts as a balance mode, 12 watts as a gaming mode, and 14 watts for pro mode. The middle two, 8 and 12, are the most realistic options for gaming on this device. You can obviously go higher than the 12 watts, but you're going to run low on battery extremely quickly. Even at the 12 watt TDP, you're going to draw over 20 watts of total power on a 38 watt hour battery, so that's less than 2 hours. So let's do a comparison between this and the Steam Deck at those wattages. What you can see right away is that comparing this to the Steam Deck is not really fair. You get around a 25% bump at 8 watts on the Steam Deck and at least a 10% bump at 12 watts. So yeah, it's not fair, and I really am only even showing this because I'm a Steam Deck channel and I know people are going to ask. But these are two very different chips. Nonetheless, comparisons aside, the Air Pro is once again formidable in its weight class. Arkham Knight, Forza, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider all have an average of over 30 FPS at 12 watts. Even Cyberpunk could be considered playable at 12 watts, and the fact that I can pull a PC out of my pocket and play games like Elden Ring, Spider-Man, and God of War is pretty mind-boggling. So I think this review has been pretty gushing about the Air Pro, but over the last few months, it never really became my daily driver or anything close to it. And it's not just because I'm a Steam Deck content creator. I think I struggled a lot writing this review, and part of it is this dichotomy that I faced. The Air Pro is objectively an amazing machine, but in my so-called day-to-day use of it, I encountered too many hurdles that kept me from picking it up. Some of these are intensely personal, and some of these are things that I think many people would run into. The first thing that was a hurdle for me personally was actually the small size. I think most people are not going to have the same problems as I do here. I have large hands and I find, say, the Nintendo Switch uncomfortable to use for extended sessions. After an hour, I start to feel some light soreness. After a few consecutive days of an hour at a time, the soreness begins to compound. It turns out that the Steam Deck is the perfect size for someone like me. To be fair, I knew this already, but I hoped that the thickness and the ergonomic bumps in the Air Pro would make it more amenable to my hands, but it didn't work out for me. Similarly, I think the gorgeous screen was a little too small. Because these games are designed for the PC, even the Steam Deck occasionally requires the use of a built-in magnifier. Sometimes fonts or on-screen elements are just too hard to see. This was even a problem on a game called Ghost Song. Ghost Song is an excellent indie Metroidvania that recently released onto Steam, and it's the perfect sort of game for the Air Pro, but the map was pretty hard to see on the small screen. I certainly made do and I got adjusted, but it's more of a strain than it is on a Steam Deck. Then on top of that, it's like I said, it's unfair to compare the performance to a Steam Deck. First of all, the Steam Deck has sort of a higher ceiling. It has a larger battery, the OS uses up fewer resources as a baseline, and power used on components other than the CPU seems lower on the deck than it does on the Air Pro. But not only does the deck have a higher ceiling, but it's more efficient per watt too. You get more power out of the Steam Deck even in low wattage scenarios. This isn't surprising, mind you, it just really affected what I decided to play. Finally, despite the efforts from AYANEO, there was some clunkiness with the built-in tooling. iSpace didn't recognize my Humble Bundle games, the control panel would sometimes not show up, Gyro requires a whole other tool to get working properly. There really is no guide button per se. Updating the controller driver was clunky, and worst of all, my controller stopped working as I was making this video. That one was my own fault, but it would have never happened if the AirPro's gyro functionality was more flexible. You see, as it is, you have to configure gyro through ISpace, and there are relatively limited options. It can only emulate the right analog stick, so that means that I can't simultaneously use that analog stick for flick stick. The gyro also requires you to hold the button, either LB or LT, to use it. All of this makes it a lot less flexible than configuring gyro via Steam input. There's a solution for this by way of an app called Handheld Companion, which uses the onboard gyro to make Windows believe you're using a PlayStation controller instead of an X input controller. Long story short, it was cloaking my original controller even after I thought I had turned it off and uninstalled it completely, which caused me to do some extended troubleshooting. An error on my part, but not an unforced error, I would say. And listen, I didn't want to spend my review comparing the Air Pro to the Steam Deck because these are very different devices, but I also couldn't neglect reality. I'm lucky to be in a position where I can play both of these, but despite some of the things that make the Air Pro so damn attractive, I really couldn't find a scenario where it made practical sense for me to pick this up over what I already had. In that way, I'm happy to see all the reviews for the AYANEO 2 because it truly seems like more of a no compromise machine, and I think that gets a lot closer to something that I would actually use. Now, they just need trackpads. Alright folks, if you want to see more of my hardware reviews, be sure to check out my hardware reviews playlist. Alright, that gang out. Goodbye!